The Lion class started out fairly simply, since the King George V class had just gotten too far down the design line by the time it was clear Japan wasn't going to stick to the naval treaties, and so the Royal Navy was left with battleships armed with 14-inch guns at a time when the Americans were going for 16-inch weapons using the treaty's escalator clause, and the Japanese seemed to be doing the same. In reality, the Japanese were actually going for 18-inch guns, which was even worse, but nobody knew that at the time. Luckily, the King George V class had originally been designed somewhat larger and then trimmed down to fit the treaty, so it was relatively simple to dust off some of the older designs, make a few tweaks, and then come up with a design that carried 16-inch guns. It was impossible to maintain the same speed and protection on the old 35,000-ton limit, but again, luckily, the escalator clause allowed for heavier ships with bigger guns. The 1938 design for the Lion class was in very many ways similar to its predecessor. They were about 40 feet longer, 2 feet wider, and had 20,000 more horsepower, but on a battleship scale looked almost identical to the older design. The most obvious visual differences were a transom stern, which was a feature that improved the ship's speed for a given amount of power by creating a wake that forced turbulent water away from the ship, without actually weighing anything. And, of course, there were the 3 triple turrets carrying 16-inch guns, with a pair super-firing forward and a single turret at the rear. They would also be slightly faster, with a maximum speed of 30 knots, secondary armament consisting of 8 dual-purpose twin 5.25-inch turrets and 6 octuple 40mm mounts, 15-inch belt armour, and 6-inch deck armour, as in King George V, made the ships very heavily protected as well. It was intended to build a pair of these ships each year, starting in 1938, until 6 ships had been built. The first 2, Lion and Temeraire, were laid down in 1938, with the next pair, Conqueror and Thunderer, having contracts awarded, but were never actually laid down. The final pair of ships didn't even get that far. This was because the outbreak of the Second World War meant construction was suspended in order to devote resources to getting other ships that were closer to completion into service faster, and repairing war damage, much has been the fate of the later Revenge-class ships in the First World War. But by late 1941, some valuable wartime experience had been gathered, and since nothing major had been built, the design was revised to produce a more effective ship. This included a slight increase in length and a wider beam to allow for an even more extensive underwater protection system against torpedoes, and the dropping of the requirement to be able to fire the forward turret directly ahead at 0 elevation meant that a flared and raised front could be installed, which would make the ship much better in rough seas, something that would later be proved in the career of HMS Vanguard, where a similar design of hull meant that she would stay combat capable whilst accompanying USS Iowa, which was unable to fire its forward guns due to water pouring over the deck. Aircraft launching facilities were removed due to the improvements in radar, and belt armour was reduced to 14 inches, except over the magazines, in order to save some weight for other changes. The anti-aircraft armament was increased to 9 octuple and 1 quadruple 40mm mounts, and the changes to size and weight meant that the ship's speed would drop back to just over 28 knots, but with more space there was also room for more fuel, so the ships could go further. Overall, this new design would weigh about 2,500 tons more at standard displacement. However, as the war progressed and new weapons came about, there was another look at the ship's design. There was also a lot of uncertainty as to whether battleships could survive the new combat environment, and so a number of different designs were prepared. A new variant of 16-inch gun was proposed for the main armament, but the ship itself now had many possible variants. One proposed was a ship of 50,000 tons, with 12 of the new 4.5-inch guns in twin mounts replacing the 5.25-inch weapons, and numerous new sextuple 40mm Bofors guns. It was now 830 feet long, but to improve speed and endurance, a sub-variant of this at 865 feet long, with 2 more 4.5-inch mounts, was also considered, this edition having a displacement of nearly 60,000 tons. Whilst these ships would have been very intimidating, there was still more to come. Whilst impressive, the designs were still vulnerable to certain weapons that were either in development or being tested. And so at this point, things started to go a bit crazy. In an effort to save weight and expense, and also because most of the new threats were either bombs or missiles, a series of increasingly schizophrenic designs were prepared that cut the main armament down to 6 guns in a variety of layouts, either 1 triple turret forward and 1 aft, 2 triples forward, or 3 twins in the original 2 forward 1 aft layout. Belt armour was reduced to little or nothing in exchange for heavy deck armour, a huge underwater protection system, high speed, and a frankly insane level of anti-aircraft firepower. This culminated in a design with 2 triple turrets forward, fitted with an auto-loading mechanism giving a rate of fire that would actually send more shells downrange per minute than the older design with 3 triple turrets, and a carrier deck on the back, somewhat like some of the wartime Japanese refitted battleships. This would carry fighters, torpedo bombers, and charge around at 30 knots or more, presumably trying to do everything at once. Fortunately for all concerned, one British admiral, after seeing this proposal and presumably spilling his tea and dropping his monocle, uttered the following: "The functions and requirements of carriers and of surface gun platforms are entirely incompatible. The conceptions of these designs is evidently the result of an unresolved conflict between a conscious acceptance of aircraft and a subconscious desire for a 1914 fleet. These abortions are the result of a psychological maladjustment." But the crazy train hadn't yet to reach its final stop. The design teams were asked to also produce a sketch design that could actually stand up to all current and anticipated threats, whilst carrying the original planned weapons loadout. Bear in mind at this point you're talking about repelling battleships like Yamato and Iowa, dealing with rocket-powered supersonic guided missiles armed with 1,000-pound or greater warheads, as well as homing torpedoes and possibly even nearby atomic detonations. You might think that such a ship was impossible, but that's why you're not a naval designer. Proudly, the design team presented their findings. The proposed ship would carry 9 16-inch guns, 16 5.25-inch guns, 64 40mm guns, and 24 20mm guns, be capable of 32 knots, and have no less than 18 inches of belt armour, 9 inches of deck armour, and displace nearly 100,000 tons, with a length of 1,000 feet. To give you some idea of scale, that is a battleship about the same size, displacement, and speed as a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And to give you some idea of this insanity, here are some pictures of the already huge Iowa-class battleships next to a Nimitz-class carrier. By this point, it was clear that battleships, along with apparently common sense and an appreciation of reality, had long since left the realms of sensibility and established a firm hold in Fantasyland, so it should come as little surprise at this point that the whole idea sort of died out without much formal ceremony.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.